That was Sam Brown singing with the Ambrose Orchestra. And now it's good afternoon to Jim O'Hagan.
Good afternoon, Walter. Nearly everyone of a certain generation in Belfast and many further afield in the province knows the famous lines of doggerel which begin, "Barney Hughes bread, it sticks to your belly like lead." I'll not continue, and I think you know the reason why. However, I was reminded of them on a walk through Friars Bush Cemetery on Stranmillis Road last year, when I stopped to look at a tombstone there. In that tomb is buried Bernard Hughes, more popularly known as Barney Hughes, and a man very much involved with the industrial and political life of Belfast in the 19th century. Barney was born in 1808 on the 8th of July near Blackwater Town in County Armagh. He was bilingual in Irish and English, but had little formal schooling. He left school at an early age to become a bakery apprentice, where the hours of work were long and the work itself arduous. Working conditions were, as you can imagine, very grim. When he had served his time and become a journeyman, he moved in 1827-28 to Belfast, where he got employment in the town's public bakery, which was in Church Street, near the present-day Cathedral Quarter. His wages would have been between 8 and 10 shillings per week. He was a go-ahead and enterprising young man and became the bakery's manager in 1833. Barney had married Jane in 1829, probably in May Street Presbyterian Church. The officiating clergyman was the well-known firebrand divine Dr. Henry Cook. It was a mixed marriage, Barney being a Catholic. At that time, mixed marriages, I am told, were not recognised as valid by the civil authorities if they took place in a Catholic place of worship. At any rate, Jane became a Catholic a few years later, and the couple had 3 sons. In late 1840, Barney fell out with his employers for not being allowed time off to celebrate the visit of his hero Daniel O'Connell to Belfast. He felt so sore about this that he left the public bakery and set up on his own at the corner of Belfast's York and Donegal streets, just above where St Anne's Cathedral is today. Barney had always remembered the hard times he had and the unremitting toil of his early working life. So from the start he tried to be an enlightened employer. To this end, early in his time as the owner of a bakery, he was instrumental in improving working hours for bakery employees in the town. In practice, this meant that Sunday working was abolished, as was the custom of working through the night. Interestingly, on the question of the abolition of Sunday working, he was helped by the Sabbatarians of Belfast, people like Dr. Cook, who were like-minded to Barney in this respect, but for a different reason. Barney had a most cordial relationship with Cook until the latter's death, even though they differed on religion and politics. During the 1840s, he was able to increase output at his bakery by moving from the use of a single oven in production until eventually the plant operated with 6 ovens in use. Barney sold a heavier loaf than his rivals for the same price as their standard loaves. As bread was relatively dear, this was much appreciated by the public and served as a humanitarian gesture, as well as being a shrewd business practice. Barney was always a good businessman. He also made an oven publicly available for use for a fee of 1/2 penny for anyone who wanted to cook their own dish or their own loaf. As you can see, Walter, this was an extremely innovative move by him. He also established a bakery school for the training of employees, and to which other bakery firms sent their workers, as well as instituting production schedules whereby his bread remained fresher than that of his rivals. The famous Barney's baps, so well liked by the Belfast mill workers, date from very early on in his career as a bakery owner. In 1842, an attempt was made to burn his bakery down by, it is said, a group of starving weavers from Ballymacarrat in East Belfast. One can only conjecture as to the reason for this, as Barney was known throughout the town and further afield as being a charitable and humane man. Indeed, the advice, "Go and see Barney," was often given to folk who had fallen on hard times. With regard to the attempted wrecking of his premises, it is on record that he was to the fore in setting up a relief committee for destitute people in the wake of it. In the famine years of 1845 to 7, his efforts on behalf of the poor to ameliorate its effects were widely noted. However, this disastrous potato blight on the crop would ultimately create a demand for bread products, which Barney was well prepared to exploit. In 1847, he opened a second bakery on Donegal Place at the Castle Street end of Fountain Lane. This was known as the Railway Bakery, on account of Barney laying down tracks along Fountain Lane, which enabled the firm to transport the fresh bread from one part of the works to the front of the premises. At this period, many of the poorer people did suffer great hardship, which even his efforts at keeping prices as low and affordable as possible, the lowest in the trade in the town, did not alleviate, and many had to resort to charity from the soup kitchens which were set up. In the year of the opening of his second premises, his wife Jane died at the age of 44. He remarried in 1849 his second wife. She was Margaret Lowry, who subsequently bore him 3 daughters. Earlier in 1846, he had bought 2 ships, which he used to import his own grain for the flour he needed. The ships were called Jane Hughes and the Charles. In the 1850s, Barney continued to dominate bread manufacture in Belfast, introducing bread servers in the town as part of his baking operations. He also employed local agents who sold his products in outlying areas. At this time, his workers were paid 60% in wages above the trade average. Their hours of work were improved too, and cut to approximately 67 per week. This was considered very reasonable for the time. In 1853, he opened a third bakery. He had it situated in the Pound district, in what is today the Lower Falls. Many of his customers came from here as well, and it was an increased opportunity for employment for the people of that area, factors which weighed heavily in his decision to site the bakery there. For many, many years, his bakery and the adjacent flour mill, which he had built later, were landmarks in this part of Belfast. This new bakery had all of the then state-of-the-art facilities for a bread manufacturing plant, and was called the Model, and had one of the first ever ovens powered by steam. In 1858, He generously donated spare land from his bakery premises here to provide ground for the new St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church. Nowadays it is a cathedral. It was opened for worship in 1866. Barney was elected as a Liberal town councillor for the Smithfield ward of Belfast Corporation in November 1855. There were just 5 wards in the town at the time: Smithfield, Dock, Crummack, St. George's and St. Anne's. The town was markedly sectarian, with Catholics and Protestants having a mutual fear and suspicion of each other. He was the first Catholic to be elected to the council, and was genuinely non-sectarian in his approach to politics. The Tories or Conservatives dominated the council. However, within the Liberal Party there was a lot of disunity along religious lines, and this was to disillusion Barney and cause him to withdraw from political affairs for many years. The 1857 sectarian riots was another occurrence which sickened him. In 1855, he assisted John Ray, the colourful Belfast solicitor, in fighting Ray's famous Chancery Court suit against the corporation. In this, Ray took the town council to court over alleged financial irregularities by the ruling Conservatives, including John Bates, the town solicitor. He won his case, with individual councillors legally liable. The case dragged on, though, and was not eventually settled after much political wrangling until 1864. Barney got into trouble over remarks he made about Catholics. He offended sections of the Protestant community, and some newspapers late in the 1850s, when he said that the Catholics were the bone and sinew, as he put it, of the town. It was interpreted by some as meaning that Barney's co-religionists were better people and citizens. It was an unfortunate remark, and indeed ambiguous. However, he later explained that by it he simply meant that the Roman Catholics in the main carried out the more menial but no less vital jobs. Early in the 1860s, Barney became involved in what became known as the Catholic Institute, and along with a number of others like Andrew J. McKenna, incurred the opposition of the Catholic Bishop of Down and Connor, Dr. Patrick Dorian. McKenna was a very prominent newspaper editor at the time of a paper called the Ulster Observer, and he and others felt this institute would further stabilise the Catholic social position as a meeting place for them, and a place where lectures and talks could be given and attended. Dorian didn't like the idea for chiefly 2 reasons. Firstly, under the terms of its set-up, he did not have direct control over its affairs, and secondly, he feared it might become a seedbed for extremist Fenian-type political sympathies. By a series of manoeuvres, he succeeded in having the institute wound up and incurred the wrath of McKenna. Barney stood by his friendship with McKenna, and as a result both men lost the opportunity of receiving papal honours at a later stage. To be awarded a papal honour, something akin to the modern United Kingdom civic honours system, one had to have the support of one's local bishop, and this Dorian was not prepared to do for McKenna or Barney. The riots of 1864 threw the town into turmoil, with Barney becoming involved as a member of the police committee. In August of that year, Dublin had hosted a procession to unveil the statue of Daniel O'Connell. The procession was allowed by the authorities and attended by a large contingent of Belfast nationalists. At the time, under the Party Processions Act, Orangemen were forbidden to have any marches, and this rankled with their leaders, who felt they were being unfairly treated. As the nationalist train was returning from Dublin, There was to be seen a crowd from Sandy Row burning a large effigy of O'Connell on the Boyne Bridge near the station. The next evening, the ashes from the burnt effigy were taken in mock procession to Friars Bush Cemetery to be supposedly buried. But the so-called mourners were scared off by the sexton, Thomas McCabe, who threatened them with a shotgun. Things went from bad to worse when some days later a mob attacked the Catholic Pound district, and in subsequent disturbances in the general area, John McConnell from Sandy Row was killed by the Irish Constabulary. His funeral, a famous one from Sandy Row to Knox Cemetery, was attacked by a Catholic mob who lived in the vicinity of Hercules Street, now Royal Avenue. 2 schools were attacked, Brown Street and Malvern, the first by a mob of Catholic navvies and the second by a Protestant mob, and much damage done. The strife continued for 2 weeks, with several dead and many injured. At the inquest on Mr. McConnell, Barney was the 4-man juror. A split verdict was recorded. Several of Barney's bakery windows were smashed in the severe disruption of commercial life which occurred. A peace committee was formed which included himself. This toured the disrupted districts and associated workplaces. The resultant commission of inquiry placed most of the blame on the town police force for being partial to the Orange side. The force was disbanded, and the Irish Constabulary henceforth had sole responsibility for policing in the town. In the later 1860s, Barney threw much of his energy into the promotion of the Liberal cause in Belfast. In 1868, Thomas McClure was elected for one of the 2 Belfast seats in Parliament. He was to be the last parliamentary Liberal member for Belfast. From the mid-1880s, Belfast was to return 4 members. Dr. Henry Cook died in December 1868, and Barney attended his funeral and later supported plans to erect a public statue to his memory. The statue was erected in College Square East, and today it is known as the Black Man. Interestingly, the original plan was to put up the statue in Donegal Pass. Barney, it must be said, incurred stiff nationalist opposition to his views on the statue, but he stuck to his own view. In 1868, he became chairman of the Ulster Brewery in Sandy Row. However, the venture only lasted a mere 10 years. That building in its time was very handsome. In 1871, Barney was re-elected to the town council and subsequently became an alderman in JP. He was also involved in a venture called the Belfast Economic Building and Investment Society, which was set up to enable poorer people to acquire housing. Its philosophy accorded very much with his own ideas on enabling people to better themselves. In the early 1870s, he had become a member of the Home Government Association, which was the genesis of the later Home Rule movement and the Irish Parliamentary Party led by Parnell. Barney was a moderate member and was not an advocate of the complete separation of Ireland from England. In August 1872, he was a magistrate when, due to a nationalist parade in the town and the reaction to it by unionist opponents, rioting broke out once more. The turmoil went on for 5 days, with 4 killed and dozens injured. In February 1876, Barney generously donated £500 towards the building of St Mary's Hall, which stood in Bank Street opposite Kelly's Cellars for many, many years and was a popular venue for shows and concerts. In 1877, Barney Hughes opened a new and enlarged flour mill in Divis Street, near the site of his original one, and closed his bakeries in Donegal Street and Place. He had moved house to Riverston in Hollywood from his home in Belfast's town centre in 1873. Barney was to die at Riverston in December 1878 and is buried in Friars Bush, as I've said already. His son Edward took over the business. Edward moved the bakery in 1884 to a site on Belfast's Springfield Road, where it remained for nearly 100 years. It became a limited company shortly after the move. Edward died in 1893 after a short illness. The firm continued to be family-run, but its flour milling operation in Divis Street ceased in 1900. The flour mill was eventually leased in 1906 to Hughes and Dixon, the Hughes in this case being no relation, though a son of theirs was the famous songwriter and arranger Herbert Hughes. This building was eventually demolished in 1966. The family interest in the baking business ceased in 1927, shortly after the death of the chairman, Sir Peter O'Connell, who was the son-in-law of Edward Hughes and a prominent Belfast doctor. The firm continued to prosper for many years afterwards, with various mergers and links occurred later with other notable firms like J.B. Kennedy's and Isaac Andrews. But adverse economic conditions for bread making, along with the Troubles, eventually caused the firm's closure in 1979. Barney Hughes was a genuinely good man and a considerable benefactor to the town of Belfast of his day. In his time he saw the sharp decline of the Liberal Party as a force in the politics of the town, whilst he experienced too the phenomenon of serious sectarian riots, a feature of life which reappeared, alas, at regular intervals in the 20th century as well. In 2002, a fine biography of Barney by Jack McGee and published by the Ulster Historical Foundation was brought out. It is a fine rounded portrait of the man and gives in addition considerable space to many of the main political and social events of Belfast in the 19th century.
Jim O'Hagan. And now we go back to the music with Roy Irvine. Roy, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Walter.
Another famous name now.
Oh, indeed so. That's Jimmy Kennedy, songwriter, and the point is that he was born actually on the 20th of July, 1902 in Omagh. Now, he wasn't a musician really to start with, except in his spare time, but he did become a teacher in England. But he got a job at a music publishing house, and that's when he decided, I'll write a few songs. One he wrote was the Barmaid's Song, or Time, Gentlemen, Please. And he did write words to the famous Teddy Bear's Picnic. Well, Gracie Fields was going to holiday home on the Isle of Capri. This is 1934. Jimmy heard that and said, oh, well, I'll write a song. And here it is. 1934. Al Bowley is the singer with The Isle of Capri.